The Lord of the Rings as a film was an idea that we had, and it was just literally never even had a conversation about where you'd shoot it. It was just like, well, you know, we're living in the country where it should be shot.
New Zealand has always been Middle Earth to me because I was a New Zealand boy who'd never travelled anywhere else when I first read the book, you know, and so you always associate it with what you know.
If you live in New Zealand and you read that book, you kind of somehow feel that you're surrounded by Middle Earth. It's not a conscious thing, but you're just aware of the landscape, and you read the book, and the book's all about landscape, and somehow the two, you know, feel they're related in some form.
So we have landscapes, but let's build all of this art and architecture to go in them. And it was such a rare gift to hand over to a couple of conceptual artists. And it was, you know, lots of hard work.
On a typical movie, if you're doing the design work for the film, you're there for pre-production, you maybe overlap a bit into production, but the second you're really starting to get into the heavy part of production, the original design team aren't necessarily required. Whereas in Lord of the Rings, because we were doing 3 movies at once, and because it was an evolutionary process, the design process was also equally evolutionary and consuming over the entire length of the production.
I first came onto this project along with John Howe over 6 years ago. And I think we were given a rough period of possibly 6 months that we'd need to complete our part of the work. And I've just been, you know, solidly working really for 6 years.
Last week, Alan Lee did a drawing for one of the menus that's on the DVD extended cut. I mean, it's been a constant design process for these folks. And that whole thing with the design team being involved from beginning to the very bitter end was very important, I think, in terms of ensuring that Peter's vision ended up on the screen, as well as the world of Tolkien. You felt like you were there, and these guys were the reason for that.
It was always kind of, how are we going to make this better? How are we going to make it work? How are we going to please Peter, you know, to make it as he expects?
I would always be saying, of course we can do it to Peter, and I'd always be saying to our guys in the background, how the f*** are we going to do this?
So they came slowly to the White Bridge. Here the road, gleaming faintly, passed over the stream in the midst of the valley, and went on, winding deviously up towards the city's gate. Figures stood there at its head, carven with cunning in forms human and bestial, but all corrupt and loathsome.
The Minas Morgul Bridge is a corner of a road that runs towards the front gates of Minas Morgul. We ended up building the roadway itself. It started and finished perhaps over a length of 50 metres. And then we had just the beginning part of the bridge that sort of had a bit of a forced perspective thing to it, and then terminated at a blue screen that married in with the miniature of Minas Morgul. Our set included sculptures that were at the front end of the bridge that were designed by John Howe.
The design of those was actually an extravagant doodle. They just ended up appearing like that on the paper, and once I'd finished, I thought, oh, gee, those look significantly like Balrogs. I wouldn't mind having a couple actually set beside in front of my door. And this is, you know, Weta Workshop, if you're listening, make some statues, because I'd love to have a couple. Please.
We had a bit of a problem on the Minas Morgul Bridge. We had a small fire that almost destroyed the whole set.
The urethane foams that we use, if it's mixed improperly, can be dangerous.
And a pile of foam spontaneously combusted in the middle of the night.
This is all the fire damage from this morning, and all the plaster and all the first layer of foam's been burnt off, but I'm just going to bang off all the loose stuff, and then we'll plaster it again, and we'll keep it. Looks good. Hopefully they don't like the idea and we have to burn all our sets, eh?
You know, like they say, the show must go on. We pulled out the parts that had been burning. Luckily, it hadn't destroyed the whole set or the building it was in, and rebuilt it, and away we went.
Come away, hobbits. We climb. We must climb.
The Stairs of Cirith Ungol actually started in the Minas Morgul road set.
And Tolkien describes it as being quite distant from Minas Morgul, but Peter needed it to be much closer, which made perfect sense, that there be a sense of menace from climbing up this cliff face mere yards away from this eerie, horrid city.
But of course the stairs just go on and on and on up this massive mountain face.
And Tolkien describes them as though they're kind of more than vertical.
This stairway did not delve into the mountainside. Here the huge cliff face sloped backwards, and the path, like a snake, wound to and fro across it. And Frodo, glancing down, saw below him as a vast deep pit, the great ravine at the head of the Morgul Valley.
So when we're wide on that, we see that as a series of model shots. But of course, various parts along the way, quite a lot of drama happens. So we built a series of set pieces.
The guys are just starting to work on the steps here. You're going to get a step thing happening all the way down.
The last set of steps that we built really were outrageous. And occasionally you'd walk through the studio to have a look what was going on, and they'd be up there halfway up the steps hacking away at the rocks and without gear on. Those boys used to give me the horrors, but boy did we make some steps.
We had a couple of sets in which we built steps which were very, very difficult to climb.
Especially when you're fat and we've got a bag and a cloak and hobbit feet on. And Elijah was in front of me, and the pointy end of the scaffold poked me in the face all the time. I was sure I was going to lose an eye on that thing. There was lots of slipping and banging your head, and everybody associated with the movie had to endure some unique kind of suffering. And mine was those stairs of Cirith Ungol.
Shelob's Lair was a result of some workshopping and sort of dialogue that we'd had, because we'd done a lot of rock up to that point, and we had kind of exhausted a lot of our ideas about rock, and we're looking for new ideas.
And I love sandstone on the seashore because the action of the waves and the wind and the salt in the air actually erodes and eats out the rock into the most exceptional Gothic shapes. And I found the same kind of rock just out our front door in Seatoun, where the Weta workshop and the studios are. And I imagined that this marine landscape could be transposed to Shelob's Lair, where her poisonous acidity is sufficient to actually eat away at the rock and corrode it and make it this pitted surface.
But also, over the years, her body has sort of smoothed out a sort of channel where she's been dragging this great big body around.
So we incorporated as much of that as possible into the sets that we built.
The sets were incredible. I mean, these holes and halls and very creepy and twisty caverns that they had sort of created.
The set pieces we used had previously been used for the caverns below Isengard, and refoaming and reshaping a lot of the walls into this pitted environment made it quite different actually from its previous use and gave it quite a specific look.
We've got the rotten rock feel happening. It's quite prevalent in here. Obviously we're going to go for the smooth down below. That was just the sort of feel of the architecture, as it were. And then there had to be heaps and heaps of cobwebs. So we got hold of some synthetic polymer.
So it starts off like that, and then we put it in the deep fryer. So it takes about 20 minutes for it to break down into a liquid.
And you have to heat it up to 220 degrees. And if you don't get to 220 degrees, it doesn't get the right stickiness. But if you heated it to 222 degrees, it will burst into flames.
Oh yeah, that was great. The cobwebs caught fire, but our guys did everything that they could possibly have done to put it out.
So the process, was very demanding. It was always, lots of breathing apparatus and all those wonderful things.
And then you spray this stuff into cold water and you make your cobweb shape up in this water.
And what it does is it sets it. It doesn't react in it, but just cools it. And it looks like a web when you stretch it.
So it's actually quite user-friendly material, really. It's got a bit of bounce to it too, which is quite nice.
So it was actually a lot of fun to be in that environment, and especially for me to be bouncing around in the web for hours at a time.
Now, of course, hobbits and humans, if you like, weren't the only animals that would be caught in this.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, one of the things was all of Shelob's previous kills. We had a very friendly taxidermist who loaned us lots of wonderful animals that we were able to sort of hang from strings.
But we got Weta to make the corpses, the orc and urukai corpses. He's still wriggling.
We also got the guys to boil bones and things so that we'd have skeletons to wrap up in cobwebs as well. But we'd just get the carcasses from the butcher shop.
So, you know, the sort of horror of this environment grows and grows and grows until Frodo literally falls into this rotting boneyard of half-eaten, half-preserved bodies. Cirith Ungol was originally built as an outpost for the Númenóreans to look out across Mordor and to sort of be a watchtower. But it had been overwhelmed by the orcs sometime in the distant past. And, you know, over the years, they have changed parts of it in their orcish kind of way.
The crumbling remains of the Númenórean structure are still there, but there's a whole lot of orc metal and iron that's been riveted onto it.
And then they've added all these crappy old huts out of timber and, you know, bits of leather.
So it's a great coming together of different cultures and a great opportunity, really, one of the rare opportunities we have of being inside this orcish kind of environment.
It's a great piece of design, and we were stuck on how to build a set because it needed to be quite expansive.
We had to be able to follow Sam's route from the exterior and then up various flights of stairs.
So we very cleverly designed a set that in itself was not very tall, but it had so many different stairways within it that we could keep having Sean Astin running upstairs. And he was never getting any higher, but in cutting the sequence together, we were able to make it look like he was just going higher and higher. It was actually quite a fun set to be part of.
This is my favorite set. I think this is the coolest set. I love the stairs. It reminds me of those great old Hollywood movies, you know, Errol Flynn and swashbuckling stuff and coming up the stairs and Three Musketeers. I love it.
It's just the place where the orcs and the urukai have something of a civil war.
So it was very much designed with lots of drops that stuntmen could fall down and lots of material that they could fall through.
Which was a beauty of it. I mean, as an actor and a stuntman, I mean, it's just so helpful to get into character, you know?
And then part of the defences of the original castle were these sort of troughs. This is the ball ramp. Obviously we have some big balls in there ready to roll. And if you were being attacked by someone, you could just pull out the wedge that was holding the ball in place and the ball would roll down the gutter and go crashing down, you know, 300 or 400 feet. And we've got this head of the Gondorian warrior above the hole. It was one of those lovely details that came out of sort of research into medieval castles that was never a part of the plot, but it was just part of that depth and background detail that we were able to indulge ourselves with, which is great for an art department.
The top of the tower was another set that was built, and that had the red light which Sam sees. The lamp was actually made out of Gondorian helmets, just to show that the orcs were as good at improvising with rough and ready materials as New Zealanders.
And we had that set built up off the ground so that you could have the hole with the light coming up through it, and Shagrat would fall through the hole, down he'd go. The Dimholt Road itself was shot at a place called the Pinnacles, which is about 2 hours drive out of Wellington.
The location was stunning. We helicoptered into that location, and it was this really dramatic landscape.
It's compacted sort of gravel and grit that sort of solidified over the centuries.
And over the years, the erosion has cut through it, and it's cut these great chasms that are so unreal that you swear that they were generated, but in fact it is a place that exists.
A seemingly lifeless place, perfect for the paths of the dead.
I know Peter knows it well because he's filmed there before.
It's a location that Pete used in one of his earliest movies, Brain Dead. So that's kind of cool. I mean, for those people that know Peter's work.
And then we shot the actual entrance of the tunnel, the Paths of the Dead itself, in the studio. But because we knew that we were shooting at the Pinnacles for the approach, we took a lot of care in matching the sort of rock formation and the rock style for the studio set that we built with the doorway. It was all done to sort of made sure that it married in very closely with what the Pinnacles looked like.
It has skulls set into niches and these rough pillars which feel fairly Celtic and fairly primitive.
Then you go through that and you're into another studio set, which is where they're sort of walking down through the mountain and into the City of the Dead. The City of the Dead itself was basically miniatures and some big craggy rocks that we built in the studio. Then they burst out through the side of the mountain. We found a sort of rock formation down in Queenstown on Deer Park Heights. It had a slight crack in it and we added to it and built a sort of doorway. So our piece will end up joining in at that crevice up there. The other end joins into this rock here. Yeah, it took place in quite a few different places, but they all added together to make a fairly startling sequence, I thought.
The actual basic layout of Minas Tirith is pretty well established by Tolkien.
The fashion of Minas Tirith was such that it was built on 7 levels. Each delved into the hill, and about each was set a wall, and in each wall was a gate. For partly in the primeval shaping of the hill, partly by the mighty craft and labour of old, there stood up from the rear of the wide court behind the gate a towering bastion of stone, its edge sharp as a ship keel facing east.
And it was a matter of giving people what they'd expect to see. So the pleasure of Minas Tirith was really just in developing it and creating the detail and just making it as beautiful and as impressive a place as possible.
In our sort of early work, we'd done a lot of research, particularly architectural research, and the Minas Tirith research pretty much came out of Italy and the sort of middle of Europe.
I think Gondor really had a feeling of being the Rome of Middle-earth. So I think we were looking towards that Mediterranean end of things from the word go.
One of the influences was actually Mont Saint-Michel in France, and there's a smaller version of that called St Michael's Mount in Cornwall. And when you look at those places, when you look at Mont Saint-Michel, it's just so romantic and striking. And, we tried to create a more impressive and more powerful, more ancient version of that, really.
The city of Minas Tirith was by far the most extensive set that we ever built for the trilogy. And it was always going to be a difficult set to build, not just from the construction point of view, but actually where do you put this thing?
I mean, it was a gigantic set. It's like the largest set ever built in the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, it's huge. And it was built on the bones of Helm's Deep.
We'd already done Helm's Deep out at the quarry, and we decided that we'd utilise the remains of that set and actually design Minas Tirith around it so that we wouldn't have to clear everything out and go back to scratch.
And then out of the ashes of Helm's Deep rises a bigger set, Minas Tirith.
And it kind of fits in with the sort of approach we'd taken to Minas Tirith, which is it's this kind of ancient civilization which is built on top of more ancient civilizations. So you got this sense of layers and layers of ages and buildings. So it's quite appropriate that we're building one set on top of another set.
The actual build at the quarry was, from memory, about 6 months. So 6 months with about 100 guys.
And the art department were very clever in what parts of the city they built in the quarry to kind of mimic the physical base of some of these Helm's Deep structures.
The old Helm's Deep gates are actually the second gate of Minas Tirith.
We heightened it and we reclad the entire face of it and, of course, changed a lot of the details.
The old bit sort of curved round here, the old Helm's Deep and this whole area was actually cut out. An archway here has been retained.
And then Minas Tirith sort of got spread out from that central piece of set.
Second gate with the inner streets. Village itself is going to be in that area.
We used an area that was formerly beside the Great Hall of Helm's Deep, and we turned that into a further complex of Minas Tirith, and that's where Gandalf confronts the big Nazgul.
And we done a big tower up there, which was the old Hornburg Tower.
We craned the whole set piece down, put a dome on top of it, and that was one of the larger features of that third gate set.
And it was cool because, you know, I'd spent a lot of time at the Helm's Deep set, and it was great to then visit as it was being transformed into Minas Tirith, because you started to lose track of what had been where. It all kind of disappeared into this new city.
Minas Tirith. The Hobbit enters. So cool, eh? Looks incredible.
And it was a really awe-inspiring set because the entrance, the main door, was to scale. It was all correct. So it was huge.
The gates were huge.
Huge.
They're huge doors.
Yes, the doors were, 6 to 8 metres high, I suppose.
From memory, they weighed a couple of tonne each.
But of course, we had to make them able to be opened by humans, so, you know, they were very evenly balanced.
With the main gates, just wanted to make them as decorative and impressive as possible. And the idea of having a basic wooden structure which would then be covered with bronze sculptures, it just seemed really quite appropriate.
They had all these sculpted elements, almost like the doors of the baptistry in Florence, just that kind of craftsmanship.
And the gates also had to be built twice because we had to have a broken version as well as the unbroken one.
This is one of the broken gates, and here's the other one here, just a few broken timbers, etc.
I spent quite a bit of time working on this idea of a locking mechanism which would be counterbalanced so that 2 or 3 guys would be able to pull down this big kind of wooden grid. But as you pull it down, the chains that are attached to it pull up into place another kind of bolting mechanism at the top.
So when you see those teeth go up into the rock face, that actually was a practical effect that actually worked on those doors.
Inside the courtyard within the gates, we built the very base of this big stone prow that runs up the entire height.
The prow scaffolding is in place. That's the full height of the prow that we're seeing there.
I mean, you walked up to it and you're like, oh, look. I mean, it was like this gigantic wall, and granted it was made out of polystyrene in terms of the surface, but it looked real as hell. And once you went into that main square, you were surrounded by all these buildings, and there was little streets that went off in every direction.
It was built to be deliberately like a labyrinth because we wanted to be able to shoot a whole variety of different scenes on the set, different parts of the city to make you think you were at the bottom, at the middle, at the top, you know, all over the place.
We built about 4 or 5 levels, but Pete shot it in such a way that you never saw all of them at once, and you often could rearrange a few things and shoot back down the street and create another level that way.
The art department did a really great job of always having side streets and you know, walkways. You always feel like it keeps extending beyond just the physical floor plan. You know, that's just great design.
I always think around this corner of Minas Tirith there's going to be a little pizza parlour and a jewellers and a open-air cafe.
You could walk through the streets and lose yourself in that set. It was monumental.
We worked on great sets, and Minas Tirith was one of them, the streets of Minas Tirith, and they were truly amazing in terms of their scope and detail.
We tried to make it as convincing as possible and as much like you'd expect a medieval town to be.
I remember going to Siena years and years ago because it was a true medieval town that was very much like Minas Tirith in many ways. You know, it generations and generations and generations of people living there. But the town itself had at one stage been divided into various quarters where various trades had their own guilds, and those guilds had their own heraldic motifs that were mounted on buildings or on gateways and things like that. And we did similar sorts of things in Minas Tirith. We did, the Lamplight Street being kind of a metalworking area, and we did one or two of these other kind of little heraldic things. I'm sure it would have been very difficult to pick them up on the film, but it's kind of fun to invent these insignificant details, if you like, and sort of pop them around the place to just give greater depth to things.
The detail in Minas Tirith was wonderful, and my personal favourite was up one of the side streets that you'd walk, and you'd come across this little shop, like a little store, and it was the rat catcher's place.
The rat catchers, that's right. But I mean, it's not as odd as it sounds.
There would have been a rat catcher, I guess. A place like Minas Tirith would have been riddled with the things.
These are the rat catcher's cottage up there at the foot of the wall.
It wasn't ever a deliberate decision. One of the draftsmen was interpreting a little drawing that I'd done, and he'd seen a little squiggle on the side of the door, and I don't know if I had anything in mind when I did it, but he interpreted it as a dead rat. So he decided to call it the Rat Catcher's Cottage. And he just put that down, I think more as a joke than anything else, on the bottom of his sheet, which of course goes off to the props people. So this thing ended up on set with all these rat traps and dead rats hanging from it.
It's just one of those finer things that make the whole thing feel more real.
The detail was just tremendous, and it didn't all make it into the film, unfortunately, but it was fun to be there, I tell you. It really felt like you were walking in a strange, medieval kind of city, all built out of polystyrene and plaster and wood.
I mean, it was the kind of location that basically, if you had a visitor, everybody would be pleading, can we have pictures taken in front of that door, next to that wall? And I know we took pictures for some people and basically had to put it in the safe until the movie's released, and then, finally can give them back. But an amazing location.
One of the most impressive sets we went on, they're all impressive, but the big exterior set was the courtyard of the Minas Tirith palace, really.
And that we built on our backlot set at Wingate, which is also the area where we shot various other backlot sets like Osgiliath, the outside of the mines of Moria, etc. We surrounded the whole area with the stone wall that defined the shape of the top of the prow.
And we built that as a forced perspective set, so when you stood at the front of the Great Hall and looked out, you got the impression that it was going on forever. But it was about a third of its film length we built for real.
And it was a wonderful open space, and in the middle of it there was a round area, and there was the Tree of Gondor, the legendary Tree of Gondor.
It is the symbol of the unbroken line of men and of kings of men of Numenor.
The actual tree itself is a tree that basically has been a huge tree in its day, and then it's almost completely died. So basically it's to look like a tree that's had a tremendous struggle.
And I had seen these trees from the Middle East that were olive trees that date back to the time of Christ. They could be 2,000 years old, these trees, and they look almost dead. And every year these olive trees still produce fruit. So, we were thinking of it in much the same sort of way. And Alan had done some drawings of what this ancient tree could look like.
So it ended up being not a huge tree, but one that looked very, very old and convoluted. And then they took the drawing and started trying to put it together.
The process is basically we start with a steel armature, and then we attach real branches onto that, and then from there we actually build the tree up, the trunk up around the branches themselves. And in this particular case we build it up as quite a healthy tree, and then we slowly cut it away so it looks like what it is, which is a very quite badly decayed tree. So we're just basically doing the last of the carving on it, and then tomorrow it should be painted, because it is a white tree, and that helps give the impression of a tree that's very, very old, almost dead, but still just hanging on to life.
The Citadel set was almost the last set we used in the main production shoot. So we had all of our studios in Miramar full. So because it was such a large set, we really were obliged to look elsewhere for another space with a required volume we needed.
And we finally found an old wharf shed that was big enough, so we decided to build the set in there.
When I first entered most of the sets, I always had to gasp at the beauty of them. When I entered the Great Wharf set, I was awestruck for a moment, because it is massive.
It had to be, almost 3 stories tall. I mean, it was just gigantic.
It's a very large space, but it was only just wide enough to contain our set. And the windows on either side were actually just a couple of feet away from the wall.
We showed Andrew Lesney, and he said, I can't get my lights in behind there. We're going to have to do something drastic here.
So we spoke to the Harbour Board and got their permission to cut holes in their concrete wall.
Great big wide concrete walls that we had to cut holes in. Unbelievable.
So they could shine lights from outside to represent the sunshine streaming through the windows.
The Citadel is the seat of power in Minas Tirith, but Denethor is on the throne, and the room itself has to have this slightly solemn aura, as was described in the book.
No hangings, nor storied webs, nor any things of woven stuff or of wood were to be seen in that long, solemn hall. But between the pillars there stood a silent company of tall images graven in cold stone.
In each niche there was a carved statue of one of the former kings. So it kept our team with their hands out of their pockets for another 6 months, yeah.
And it was beautiful. It was just all these kings of old all along this amazing set.
And we also used a black marble for the pillars and an alternating dark and light stone for the archways, which is kind of borrowed from Charlemagne's chapel, which is a beautiful building, very, very rich.
The detail was perfect. Everywhere you went, the detail was perfect. And so you've got this view as you walk through, and down the end is this incredible throne.
The King of Gondor's throne is at the top of a flight of marble stairs, and is made of marble and is quite highly decorated.
And then down at the foot of the steps to that plinth, beside the steps, was the smaller throne, which was Denethor's throne.
Which is a much simpler kind of black stone.
Because he wasn't the king, he was only the steward, you see.
And hanging above the throne is a crown, and Tolkien describes a kind of stone canopy, but I thought that a metal crown would be quite a nice feature to have.
Which is a great symbolic gesture, really, because the crown is there, the throne is there, but the one thing missing is the figure of the king himself.
The Minas Tirith set had this great kind of feeling of age and dignity.
In fact, I couldn't keep away from it. I sort of would wander out there at weekends, and it was like walking around in some hill town in Italy.
It's that sort of magical place you go to on holiday.
A lot of good memories of Minas Tirith.
During the principal photography, we had a policy of not really building sets in the parking lot of the Stone Street studios. But the situation for pickups of Return of the King was different, because we weren't able to travel to all the locations again.
Well, we had sort of a very tight schedule, and we had a lot of sets to shoot.
And so bits of those places, if they were needed for reshooting, had to come to Stone Street.
So you could walk down the parking lot at Stone Street, which now had become a back lot, and you could walk through Middle-earth.
You'd walk in there and there'd be exterior Edoras right in front of the stables.
There was bits of Orthanc.
We rebuilt 2/3 of the Golden Hall.
Just behind there was Rohan.
You'd have the Green Dragon.
There were bits of Pelennor Fields.
Then there was the other walls of Minas Tirith.
I think they was part of Mount Doom.
All of this in one parking lot.
You'd sort of turn one direction, there would be Edoras. You'd spin around 90 degrees, there would be Minas Tirith. Spin around there'd be the Houses of Healing. It was they were all over the place.
I could be lying down on the battlefield and see Billy and Ian doing a scene in Minas Tirith. You know, they were like a stone's throw away.
And just beyond the parking lot was some industrial warehouses, but also like there was a supermarket back there, and it was just amazing to think that like this incredible movie is being shot, and you know, you could just be going and doing your groceries and then park your car and look out the back and you could see like a Harad Tower.
Well, that's when you thought that, you know, they should have just left that there, all the stuff that was in Stone Street, and just opened a sort of, you know, Disneyland for Middle-earth.
People have said it's like a theme park. Yes, it was. It was the full Middle-earth experience.
I mean, if you'd walked in with no preparation to that, you would have thought, wow, this is really a circus. How can they possibly make sense of this?
Peter had his bikes with his name on them, and he'd get on his bike and cycle from one unit to the other.
Highly sophisticated transport mode. Very, very big budget mechanical device. Oh.
Pete would blaze by on his bicycle, you know, with a sandwich in his hand or something. Or, you know, on a cell phone sticking out of his pocket, and script pages like falling out of his back pocket, and it was just completely insane.
And with the actor availability and the scheduling, we had to turn these sets around overnight in a lot of cases.
What that resulted in was this constantly changing series of sets going up and down on the back lot.
It was a fairly daunting prospect, and during that period we had a full greens team and a full construction team.
I had guys working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
There was a lot of very exhausted people, a lot of very blocked up situations.
There was often a few problems, like we had a huge field, and just in front of that we had the Edera stables exterior, and we had to get the elephant onto the back set.
We've got an incredibly practiced crew at this point. Most of them have been doing this for 4 years or so. We'll go through the night and get this set up. It's this sort of 10-hour turnaround, put the old elephant in place, and it's going to look good.
Doing pickups is quite hard because you are trying to match something that already exists, and you're trying to match it in some cases like 2 years after the fact.
If we're going back to a set, we look at footage from the film, we look at continuity photographs, we look at construction photographs, and we've tried all the way through to keep a little piece of most sets.
But in some instances, you know, it just doesn't exist anymore, so you're actually building some stuff from scratch all over again, and in certain instances, you're actually relying on a lot of the guys' memories.
It was tricky, but it was great. You know, it's about doability, and you just say, well, can you do it? Yes, you can do it. Okay, let's do it.
And it made it quite exciting, actually. It felt like you were on a real Hollywood backlot, not a abandoned paint factory in Wellington, New Zealand.
Visually, the foundation of this movie trilogy is the design. There were incredible sets, incredible craftsmanship.
I think, like the acting, it was an ensemble piece. You know, it was everyone's energy and attention to detail and love of the project that created this fantastic result.
In one sense, there's quite a sense of relief because everyone has done their part and it's all worked.
It ended up being doable, you know. It wasn't, we didn't fall over, and we did make it look great.
And it's just great to see the Academy recognize that and give those guys the Oscar. It meant a great deal to us.
I came to realise then kind of what it meant to have worked on such a big film.
I don't know if I'd ever imagined in my life that I might win an Oscar. It's a fantastic thing and something that I'll treasure forever, along with my memories of the people that I've met. And, you know, those, I think, are probably the most precious things that I'll take away with me. The long-term friendships that I will have established while I've been here.
It just seemed to be that the journey goes all the way to the end and ends well.
That was 6 years ago that we started this, and we're still just finishing off the last few shots for the DVD, so it's been a very, very long process.
In a way, I think me going home to Devon is going to be a little bit like the Hobbits going back to the Shire, and it's right that it should be. You know, everything will fall into perspective, and I'll have my memories, and and I'll always treasure them.
It's the end of an era, really, and it has been quite a long haul.
5 years of high tension and effort and laughter and tears and, you know, stress and delight. It was a very emotional time, a good time.